We welcome you once again to our Wonderful Day in the Lord broadcast. We're looking at Psalm 31 today, and I think this will be a psalm that will give you a wonderful day in the Lord. It probably is an overlooked psalm. There's so many other prominent and well-known psalms that we adore and love and turn to. Psalm 31 probably doesn't get much attention, but I think you will really appreciate and enjoy what we look at today. And I think this will get you started in a good day, a good way to start your day. We'll look at only the first 5 verses of the psalm. The psalm in its context, and you can look at that later, is telling about the psalmist's problems and difficulties he's facing. He's in turmoil. He's under perhaps some kind of danger. But that's not unusual for the psalmist. And so many of our psalms are written in that kind of context. And this one is one of those. But what I want to look at is the first 5 verses where this psalmist goes straight to the Lord before he goes to his problem. Now, he's going to get to the problems. He's going to talk about that. And we even see that to some degree in the first 5 verses. But what we see more prominently is that he goes to the Lord first. And he thinks about who the Lord is. He calls out to the Lord and so forth. So we want to look at that together in Psalm 31. And what we see here, first of all, is he turns to the Lord and he describes the Lord by a number of ways. We start with verse 1. Let me read verse 1 to you. In you, O Lord, I have taken refuge. Let me never be ashamed. In your righteousness, deliver me. Incline your ear to me. Rescue me quickly. Be to me a rock of strength and a stronghold to save me. So as he begins this psalm, he's calling out to the Lord. He needs the Lord's help. And we'll look at some of that in a minute. But in verse 2, he calls the Lord his rock and the rock of his strength. This particular word for rock is a word that means something to stand on. Like you think of a rock that you stand on. Well, that's what that means. And so the Lord is the one that he can depend upon, his foundation. He can stand on that. But then in verse 3, he says, for you are my rock and my fortress. And this is a different Hebrew word here, and it doesn't mean a rock that you stand on, but rather a kind of a crag or a cliff that is sheltering the individual. So he finds himself underneath this rock of shelter. So he uses 2 different words for rock right off the bat, depicting that the Lord is his foundation and his strength. He can stand on him, but also that he is his protection and he can be sheltered by this rock. Next, he talks about him being a fortress. Verse 3, for you are my rock and my fortress. So when we think of a fortress, we think of a fort, some place where we can go to for rescue. We have the enemy chasing us. We run to the fort, the gate is closed, and we find protection. In verse 4, he is his strength. You will pull me out of the net, which is they have secretly laid for me. For you are my strength. So he's not depending on his own power, his army, if he has one, his own prowess as a warrior. He's turning to the Lord for strength, realizing his need for dependency upon the Lord. In verse 5, at the end, he says, O Lord God of truth. He recognized the truthfulness of God. The Lord will not deceive him. People might, but the Lord will never deceive him because the Lord is a God of truth, and he's also a redeemer. In verse 5, you have ransomed me. This is the idea of paying a price to redeem something, to redeem a person. So he's mentioned 6 different things, 5 or 6 different things here concerning who the Lord is. A rock of 2 different kinds, a fortress, a strength, a truth, a redeemer. Then he moves on as we back up in these verses and look at what he's calling out for this God that he's turning to do for him. In verse 1, he's looking for the Lord to deliver him. In your righteousness, deliver me, rescue me. He needs that. In verse 2, he asks the Lord to listen to him. And what a beautiful thought that the Lord is inclining his ear to listen to us, he says in verse 2. What a marvelous thing that the God of the universe wants to hear from us. And so he expects the Lord will listen to him. In verse 2, he speaks also of the fact that he will be saved or rescued by the Lord. So this is a deliverance that he looks for. In verse 3, he says, you are my guide. You will lead me. And so he wants to walk in the pathway that God leads him. And so he turns to him for that reason. And then in verse 4, very interestingly, he says, you will pull me out of the net which they have secretly laid for me. And so he expects it to be pulled out of this actual net that somebody has laid for him, trying to trick him up, trying to destroy him, trying to harm him, and he believes that God will pull him out of that. So if we put all this together, we see a man in trouble, a guy who has some real issues, and yet he doesn't turn to the issues, he turns to God. He recognizes who God really is, and then he calls on God to move in his life in accordance with who God really is. When we start with God that way, when that's our prayers and our thinking, the Lord will be very close and near to us, and we will have wonderful days in the Lord when we start that way. So I hope this has been a good start for you today. Tomorrow we'll look at Psalm 32.